The central issue of global interactions is the tension between cultural homogenization and cultural heterogenization. The homogenization argument often subcategories into arguments about Americanization or commoditization, but these arguments fail to consider that as forces from various metropolises are brought into new societies, they tend to become indigenized in one or other way. This is true of music, housing styles, science, terrorism, spectacles, and constitutions. The dynamics of such indigenization have just begun to be explored in a sophisticated manner, and more needs to be done. For some people, the fear of cultural absorption by larger polities is more worrisome than this scalar dynamic is tied to the relationship between nations and states and can be exploited by nation states in relation to their own minorities. The new global cultural economy must be understood as a complex, overlapping, disconnected order which cannot be understood in terms of existing center periphery models or simple models of push and pull, surpluses and deficits, or consumers and producers. Even the most complex and flexible theories of global development are inadequately quirky and have not come to terms with disorganized capitalism. Appadurai proposes a framework to explore the relationship between five dimensions of global cultural flow: ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, and ideoscapes. These landscapes are deeply perspectival constructs, influenced by the historical, linguistic, and political situatedness of different actors such as nation states, multinationals, diasporic communities, subnational groupings, movements, and intimate face-to-face groups. These landscapes are the building blocks of what Appadurai calls imagined worlds, which are multiple worlds constituted by the historically situated imaginations of persons and groups spread around the globe. The term ethnoscape refers to the landscape of persons who constitute the shifting world in which we live, such as tourists, immigrants, refugees, exiles, guest workers, and other moving groups and persons. These groups and persons affect the politics of and between nations to an unprecedented degree as international capital shifts its needs. Production and technology generate different needs, and nation states shift their policies on refugee populations. Technoscape refers to the global configuration of technology, both high and low, mechanical and informational, moving at high speeds across various kinds of previously impervious boundaries. Many countries now are the roots of multinational enterprise with complex relationships between money flows, political possibilities, and the availability of both low and highly skilled labor. The disposition of global capital is now a more mysterious, rapid, and difficult landscape to follow than ever before, because currency markets, national stock exchanges, and commodity speculations move megamony through national turnstiles at blinding speed. The critical point is that the global relationship between ethnoscapes, technoscapes, and financescapes is deeply disjunctive and profoundly unpredictable, as each landscape is subject to its own constraints and incentives, some political, some informational, and some techno-environmental, while acting as a constrained parameter of movements in the other. Thus, even an elementary model of global political economy must take into account the shifting relationship between perspectives on human movement, technological flow, and financial transfers which can accommodate their deeply disjunctive relationships with one another. Mediascapes and ideologies are two related landscapes of images that shape the world. Mediascapes refer to the distribution of electronic capabilities to produce and disseminate information, such as newspapers, magazines, television stations, and film production studios, and the images of the world created by these media. These images involve many complicated inflections depending on their mode, hardware, audiences, and the interests of those who own and control them. They provide large and complex repertoire of images, narratives, and ethnoscapes to viewers worldwide, blurring the lines between the realistic and fictional landscapes they see. Mediascapes tend to be image-centered, narrative-based accounts of strips of reality, offering a series of elements such as characters, plots, and textual forms out of which scripts can be formed of imagined lives. These scripts can get disaggregated into complex sets of metaphors, helping to constitute narratives of the other and proto-narratives of possible lives. Ideas are also concatenations of images, often directly political and often have to do with the ideologies of states and counter ideologies of movements explicitly oriented to capturing state power or a piece of it. These ideoscapes are composed of elements of the Enlightenment worldview, which consists of series of ideas, terms and images including freedom, welfare, rights, sovereignty, representation, and the master term democracy. The differential diaspora of these keywords has loosened the internal coherence which held these terms and images together in a Euro-American master narrative, providing instead a loosely structured synopticon of politics. The relationship of reading to hearing and seeing may vary in important ways that determine the morphology of these different ideoscapes, and they shape themselves in different national and transnational contexts. Appadurai discusses the conditions under which current global flows occur, focusing on the growing disconnections between ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes, and ideoscapes. These disconnections have become central to the politics of global culture as people, machinery, money, images, and ideas now follow increasingly non-isomorphic paths. Deterritorialization is one of the central forces of the modern world, as it brings laboring populations into lower class sectors and spaces of relatively wealthy societies, while sometimes creating exaggerated and intensified senses of criticism or attachment to politics in the home state. Deterritorialization also creates new markets for film companies, art impresarios, and travel agencies who thrive on the need of the deterritorialized population for contact with its homeland. These invented homelands, which constitute the mediascapes of deterritorialized groups, can often become too fantastic and one-sided that they provide the material for new ideologies in which ethnic conflicts can begin to erupt. The idea of deterritorialization may also be applied to money and finance, as money managers seek the best markets for their investments independent of national boundaries. These movements of money are the basis of new kinds of conflict, as Los Angeles worry about the Japanese burying up their city, and people in Bombay worry about the rich Arabs from the Gulf states who have not only transformed the prices of mangoes in Bombay but also substantially altered the profile of hotels, restaurants, and other services in the eyes of the local population. In this fertile ground of deterritorialization, money, commodities, and persons are involved in ceaselessly chasing each other around the world, finding their fractured and fragmented counterpart. The ideas and images produced by mass media often are only partial guides to the goods and experiences that deterritorialized populations transfer to one another. The tragedy of displacement in Meera Nair's film India Cabaret illustrates the multiple loops of this fractured deterritorialization as young women barely competent in Bombay's metropolitan glitz come to seek their fortunes as cabaret dancers and prostitutes in Bombay, catering to ideas about Western and foreign women and their looseness. These tragedies of displacement could be played in a more detailed analysis of the relations between the Japanese and German sex tours to Thailand and the tragedies of the sex trade in Bangkok. The relationship between states and nations is an imbalanced one, with nations seeking to capture or co opt states and state power, while states aim to capture and monopolize ideas about nationhood. This disjunctive relationship has two levels. At the level of any given nation state, where there is a battle of the imagination, the state and nation seeking to cannibalize one another, and at another level, deeply entangled with global disjunctures. The cultural politics that have subverted the hyphen that links the nation to the state are moved in the irregularities that now characterize disorganized capital. Labor, finance, and technology are now so widely separated that the volatility that underlie movements for nationhood dined against the vulnerabilities which characterize the relationships between states. States find themselves pressed to stay open by the forces of media, technology, and travel, which have fueled consumerism throughout the world and increased the craving for new commodities and spectacles. These very cravings can become caught up in new ethnoscapes, mediascapes, and eventually ideoscapes such as democracy in China that the state cannot tolerate as threats to its own control over ideas of nationhood and peoplehood. States throughout the world are under siege, especially contests over the ideoscapes of democracy are fierce and fundamental, and where there are radical disjunctures between ideoscapes and technoscapes, ideoscapes and finance, ideoscapes and ethnoscapes, and between ideoscapes and mediascapes. The transnational movement of the martial arts, particularly through Asia, as mediated by the Hollywood and Hong Kong film industries, is a rich illustration of how long-standing martial arts traditions, reformulated to meet the fantasies of contemporary youth populations, create new cultures of masculinity and violence, which are in turn the fuel for increased violence in national and international politics. Such violence is the spur to an increasingly rapid and immoral arms trade that penetrates the entire world. The worldwide spread of the AK-47 and the Uzi in films, corporate and state security, in terror and in police and military activity is a reminder that apparently simple technical uniformities often conceal an increasingly complex set of loops, linking images of violence to aspirations for community in some imagined world. The central paradox of ethnic politics in today's world is that primordia such as language, skin color, neighborhood, or kinship have become globalized. This has led to sentiments that ignite intimacy into political sentiment and turn locality into a staging ground for identity, spreading over vast and irregular spaces. This is not to deny that such primordia are often the product of invented traditions or retrospective affiliations, but to emphasize that because of the disjunctive and unstable interplay of commerce, media, national politics, and consumer fantasies, ethnicity has become a global force, forever slipping through the cracks between states and borders. The between cultural and economic levels of the new set of global disjunctures is not a simple one-way street. The terms of global cultural politics are set wholly by or confined wholly within the vicissitudes of international flows of technology, labor, and finance. There is a deeper change by the disjunctures between all the landscapes and constituted by their continuously fluid and uncertain interplay, which concerns the relationship between production and consumption in today's global economy. Production fetishism refers to an illusion created by contemporary transnational production loci, which masks translocal capital, transnational earnings flows, global management, and often faraway workers in the idiom and spectacle of local control, national productivity, and territorial sovereignty. The locality becomes a fetish disguised by the globally dispersed forces that drive the production process. The fetishism of the consumer involves the transformation of the consumer into a sign, both in Baudrillard's sense of simulacrum, approaching the form of a real social agent, and in the sense of a mask for the real seat of agency, which is not the consumer but the producer and the many forces that constitute production. The central feature of global culture today is the politics of the mutual effect of sameness and difference to cannibalize one another, proclaiming their successful hijacking of the twin enlightenment ideas of the triumphantly universal and the resiliently particular.